Nau mai, hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihine, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Annie Murray, who is the still very fresh, I think she said 10, 12 weeks in the job. She's the new Chief Executive of the New Zealand Film Commission, which is an agency with quite a broad remit to deal with film in New Zealand. It funds film, it helps develop filmmakers, and it sort of helps interact with incoming international productions, particularly by way of administering various rebate schemes for money spent on production in this country, not just across film, but also increasingly across television as well. I think Annie is quite well suited for this evolved, converging world of screen production, and that for the vast bulk of her career to this point, she has worked in television. She's had significant roles at TVNZ, at Whakata Māori, Sky TV, and New Zealand On Air, and so she just has deep links with the production community, and there's a huge amount of crossover between film and television, even though on some level from a legislative and an agency perspective, we treat them like they're quite separate worlds. But we talk about, and I think she gives quite an interesting answer to the idea of a big merged agency like they have in Australia that sort of wraps around the whole sector and allows it to work in a coordinated way. She talks about how they're doing that with Te Mangai Paho and New Zealand On Air in their own way. But there's obviously a big opportunity there if anyone in government actually wants to do the hard work of unifying that thing. So basically it's a big conversation about the state of film in New Zealand and inevitably touches on the writers and actors strikes and the sort of plight of cinemas, and just a window into the current state of New Zealand film, what's going right, where there are issues, and where she'd like to see it go. And yeah, really, really fun to talk more about film. And this is Annie Murray, new Chief Executive of the New Zealand Film Commission, on The Fold. Tēnā koe, Annie, and welcome to The Fold.
Oh, kia ora, Duncan. Nice to be here.
So great to have you up, especially, given you're quite fresh in this very big, very exciting new role. I wondered if you could start by just explaining what it was about the job that attracted you to it.
Well, I've been empowering New Zealand stories for 20 years as a TV commissioner, and I was ready for a new challenge. I was ready to step up into more of a leadership role, but also bring with me all that experience of working with our most exceptional creatives and empowering New Zealand stories, as well as the kind of commitment to diversity that I've made through my career. And when I read the mission statement of the Film Commission, which is to empower New Zealand creatives, exceptional New Zealand creatives, to produce enduring taonga, I thought, wow, that's me. That's what I've been doing all this time. I want to do more of it.
And there's actually quite a few threads there that I want to pull on, but before we do, I wonder if it's worth just for our listenership that might not necessarily be familiar with the minutiae of the Film Commission, just explaining its scope and all the various parts of what it seeks to do.
Yeah, so obviously funding New Zealand film is the core business, and we have around about $20 million a year to spend on New Zealand film, so that gets eked out across 10 to 12 projects. It's slightly contentious in that there's never enough money to go around. So,
slightly.
There's got to be some decisions made there, obviously. We also have the job of attracting international production into New Zealand and administering the screen rebate, which we can talk about a bit more. And we also have a talent development remit. So we are about developing those exceptional creatives, identifying them early in their career and providing opportunities to bring them through to making feature films. The other side of what we do is that we market the films once they're made. So we have a team who are actively out in the markets and at festivals promoting and supporting our films out into the world.
And do you have a sort of like a specific vision of your own for how you seek to evolve the Film Commission? Because obviously the way that audiences, and we might touch on where the audiences data that just came out yesterday as we record this in a bit, but all media forms are in a state of kind of rapid evolution at the moment. Do you have a sense of how you want to kind of imprint upon the organisation in that context?
The really important thing to understand is that film is alive and well. There are still audiences for film, and they're coming back to cinemas after COVID. So audiences are about 19% down on where they were in 2019, but nevertheless coming back. And what you see with a weekend like the Barbie and Oppenheimer opening weekend, $5 million spent at the New Zealand box office, the success of Red, White and Brass this year, it shows you that New Zealanders will come out for the films that they want to see. So I just want to make that point up front. It's still an incredibly important part of the distribution landscape that we have a cinema release. For me, what I'd love to see is, well, the two things we look at is when we're considering an application is box office. Is this going to get bums on seats? And critical reception. So is it going to be critically well received and, be able to be placed at premium festivals around the world? And ideally, you want to achieve both of those things with every film. It's not always possible, but that's the ideal. So what I'd really like to see us move towards is being mindful of our changing demographics as a country, being more audience-focused, so understanding what's happening with our demographics, that we have a much more diverse mix of people in New Zealand now, and it's going to become more so. So because film has a really long gestation period, can be 7-9 years in the making, we've got to be thinking a long way ahead. We've got to have our eye on the future, and our population is changing rapidly. So our films need to cater to that audience, but also to those who want to tell the stories. So we've got a bit of an equity job to do in creating opportunities for our diverse filmmakers to come through.
So you touched on a few things in there, one of them being audiences, both the positive of the sort of Barbenheimer phenomenon and Red, White and Brass, but also some of the challenges around meeting an increasingly diverse New Zealand and creating product that ultimately that finds them one way or another. Obviously, cinemas is the top of the tree. Do you have a sense of what the audience for the Film Commission's output in recent years looks like from a sort of a demographic perspective, and through that into equity, I suppose? I
think what we've done is really what I've seen in linear television over 20 years is we've superserved a certain audience, and that is an audience that's dwindling, it's getting older, and we need to really consciously shift to understanding the audiences that are coming through, that they're diverse, they're young, there's a very large, super diverse under 35 population in New Zealand. We need to be, and that's where Red, White and Brass hit. We need to be more actively, consciously funding films for them. That's not to say that we won't also be catering to our older demographics, because they're still a very important audience, and they are also cinema goers. They love getting out to the movies, so we kind of need to do all of it.
What about the sort of relationship with broadcasters? Even the name seems kind of quaint now, but basically the New Zealand, the likes of 3, TVNZ, the secondary markets, I suppose, for film after cinema, but still an opportunity to find significant audiences there. Where is your thinking in terms of that part of the audience equation? Well,
if you go back to our mission statement about creating enduring taonga, that's where they come into the mix, because you might have noticed in the last year we've had Whale Rider, Boy and Hunt for the Wilder People all play on linear television, and still reaching 100,000 plus people. And, Whale Rider is how old now? Probably 20 years old. So that's an important part of the mix, not only at the beginning when we're financing a film or when a producer is trying to pull the money together. What can happen there is that there's a broadcast deal done at the front end. It can also happen later, and then it happens again and again and again over the life cycle of the film. So it's an important part of the mix.
In terms of because you sit at the centre of an ecosystem in a way, but it's also... And there are things you can control. You've got your budget and your relationships on, and things that you can't. And the impact of the writers and actors strikes, which are, as we record this, still unresolved. And I don't have a huge... I'm not particularly worried that in the next couple of weeks they're likely to kind of make to be resolved, unfortunately. How and that impacts cinemas, like how much material they've got. It also impacts the flow of productions into this country. How much is the local industry hurting at the back of those strikes? Yeah,
there's definitely been an impact. We do have quite a number of crew who service those international productions. Really highly creative, high tech, very expert. Large number of people who work in that space, and those productions have paused, Minecraft being the most high-profile one of those. So those people are feeling it absolutely. Contracts that they thought they had have been cancelled or put on hold, and they can't see where the next job is coming from. So I feel aroha for them. And beyond that, what we're seeing is the promotion of films has become an issue too, so that actors who are affiliated with SAG or who want to be in the future are not available to promote films at the moment because they're, sympathising with the strikes. And then what we're going to see, of course, with the writers having been off work for such a long time in Hollywood, there'll be a big gap probably next year, and that will roll through over the next several years. On the upside, though, this is an opportunity for local film. So we are working really closely with our creative community to get those local films funded and get them into production. We've got 2 films in production in the next month, Tina and Kōka. And what they're able to benefit from is that some of that crew who are no longer engaged on the big international productions are available. And there are fantastic learning opportunities and mentoring and all of that good stuff that goes with bringing in people who've had the experience on the really big budget international films and TV shows back across to the local industry.
Have you, obviously a big part of your role is to, engage with that sector. Is there a fear amongst them that if this thing goes on long enough, because obviously we're coming out of an era where, for an entirely different reason, the cinemas were under incredible pressure during the pandemic, both from a content and an audience side. That if this drags on, that it might do damage that can't be undone by some time. That it actually becomes kind of lasting or more kind of profound.
I'm not hearing that. What I'm hearing is a level of anxiety around livelihoods and ability to, pay their bills and concern about how long that's going to go on for. I don't think anybody's thinking this won't resolve. It's a case of when it will resolve. The talks are ongoing. They're fractious and difficult in terms of resolving the differences. But they will get there. I mean, it's 1960 is the last time there was a strike of this magnitude, and that's when television was introduced. So whenever there's a new business model, of course, everybody's got to figure out how it's going to work. And the streamers have been a significant disruption. And so the creatives are saying, hang on, the old ways of working don't work in this world. We need to talk about how it's going to work.
Just on the streamers, does the Film Commission have much of a relationship with thinking less about the local distribution side, but more about that big international piece? Do you Do you have relationships there or a view on how that should be conducted?
It's a really interesting one that we're talking about, and it's one of the strategic questions that the board is considering in the next few months. Really, how do we play in that space? We've had a couple of projects funded that have become streamer projects. What's really interesting, though, with the streamers is that they are recognising the value of theatrical distribution. So we've got, for example, Amazon have released Air at the theatre, and the idea is that the buzz that generates, the reviews, the word of mouth, it actually means that those titles perform a whole lot better on the streaming platform than they would if they hadn't had that theatrical window. So Apple have just ring-fenced $2 billion for productions that will get a theatrical release. So they're recognising that there's value in starting the windowing at the theatre and then going on to play out on the streamer.
It's almost one upside to the money getting tighter as people start becoming more open to an and rather than the sort of absolutist
That's
or
right.
model.
Yeah.
We've just had a resolution of what was quite a fractious situation of our own with the screen production rebate, no longer a grant, being kind of codified. Do you want to just, again, explain what happened there, how it functions, and give a bit of a sense of how it's landing, for people who are seeking to access that?
The rebate is, there's two strands to it. There's the domestic one and there's the international. If I start with the domestic, that is a up to 40% rebate on local production. So for every $100 that gets spent on certain types of spending on local production, up to $40 can come back in the rebate. There's a threshold that production needs to reach. So we're not talking very small, low-budget film or TV. We're talking higher budget stuff. And how it works is the producer applies for a provisional they put in a provisional application that gives them a signal that, yep, you're going to pass the test, away you go. So they've got the confidence then to do their budgeting. They usually borrow some money to cash flow that 40% rebate, and then they get it back when they get the 40% when they deliver the program. So what's changed there is that there are an interim payment can be made now, so they don't have to wait until the end. So that's reduced interest costs. So that's a really good win for producers. But what's the real game changer is being able to combine the rebate with New Zealand On Air and Te Māngai Pāho funding, which wasn't available before. Well, it was for children's drama and for animation, but it's now available to all genres. So that's a huge boost for the local industry. And we will see quite soon the first few projects coming through from New Zealand On Air's special funding round coming in for the rebate. The second part of it is the international side, and that's a 20% rebate, and that's quite straightforward. The production comes into the country, they spend the money, and they get the rebate when they're finished. And that's straight 20%, quite straightforward, and that makes it quite an attractive thing, makes New Zealand an attractive destination because that is an efficient process, and there's not sort of subjective what if this or what if that, it's just straightforward. What we've found in research is that for every dollar that gets rebated, there's at least another $7 of economic value generated in our economy. So, this is spending not only directly on crew, but also accommodation, transport, freight, set building, electricians. There's a really wide range of people who feed into filmmaking, and not only in the typical centres of Auckland and Wellington, but out in the regions as well.
There is a persistent critique of the subsidy, grant, rebate, pick your term of choice, that comes from the likes of the ACT Party or the New Zealand Initiative around, and has sort of become more acute with the layering of Te Mangai Paho and New Zealand On Air's ability to interact. What is your response to that critique, I suppose?
I'll go back to the maths and the fact that this is a rebate that's administered by MB, so the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment, because they see the economic value of the rebate. If you look at the international one, they spend $100, they get $20 back. We get $80 in our economy that wouldn't be here otherwise. They would go to Australia or Canada or South Africa. That's the simple maths of the equation. Then you add into that the value in terms of workforce development, so the opportunities for careers created by this filmmaking activity and TV making is extraordinary. And these are high-value careers that can take people worldwide. They are well paid and they are creative, and it's a fantastic industry to work in. So there's multiple strands to it. But I think in the economy that we have at the moment, if we go back to the economic argument, that it's a $20 spend for an $80 return into our economy, it makes it actually quite simple.
There's a specific example which I reported on a couple of weeks ago as we record this, which sort of seemed to sit slightly uneasily at the intersection of a few of these different concepts and asked a bit of a question about what a New Zealand film is. I'm talking about The Canyon here. Do you want to just sort of... And the decision by DGANZ, the Directors and Editors Guild, not to grant a letter of non-opposition. This is absolute acronym hell that we're in here, unfortunately. But do you want to talk about The Canyon and whether there is there is any closer to a resolution on that, which, it's not a huge production, but it's reasonably substantial at a time when the industry would quite like almost anything to be happening?
Oh, I totally agree with you. That filmmaking activity is super important, particularly at the moment when we've got a lot of crew out of work. So what I can update you on is that the director received his visa yesterday. So what had happened, just for the benefit of the listeners who may not get the ins and outs of it, The Canyon is a production coming in, it's a film to be made in New Zealand.
From a New Zealand script, New Zealand producer.
Yeah, New Zealand writer, New Zealand producers, but an international director. And what has to happen with the international director coming in is they apply for a visa, and the immigration department asks for a letter of support from, they're not called a LONO anymore, which was the letter of non-objection. They're actually a letter of support. They apply for that from the Directors Guild, Directors and Editors Guild. So in this instance, it was declined. Directors Guild said, no, we're not going to support a non-New Zealander directing this project to receive a New Zealand 40% rebate. We don't agree with that. They're within their rights to do that. Further to that, they could have actually objected. They could have added material to object. My understanding is that they didn't do that, but they'd made their point. We've got an issue with this. As it stands, the Immigration Department weighed up all the information, they sought additional information, and they've granted the visa. So the director's on his way, I understand.
Right, and that's obviously these issues are sort of complex and layered in some respects, but good to hear that that's arrived at a conclusion. One thing about, just switching tack slightly, your role is that you actually came into a seat that had been vacant for, I think, more than a year. How, in the aftermath of David Strong, the previous CE, taking extended leave of absence and ultimately resigning over what was perceived, correct me if I'm wrong, as a kind of poorly handled conflict of interest situation, which interacted with the board. what has the organisation and its governance learned from that episode, and then can you talk about the sort of general health of the Commission as you found it, given that they'd been leaderless for such a long time?
They hadn't been entirely leaderless. Mladen Ivancic had stepped up again, as he has many times over the years, an incredible 33-year career at the Commission, and I think he'd been the acting CEO, he'd lost count, but 6 or 7 times. So Mladen was there, as a steady hand on the tiller. But what had been paused was, the kind of strategic thinking, change and evolution was on hold. So I've been into that stuff very quickly, and with the support of the board, who are also very keen to see things moving. In terms of the conflict of interest stuff, what I've found is a very robust conflict of interest management process, which has been beefed up after the issue last year with David Strong. So there are and they're all on the website for everyone to see. So that process is alive and working well, and there is a heightened awareness, I think it's fair to say, of how conflicts are managed, identified, declared and managed. And in our industry, being such a small country, there's a lot of perception of conflict. There's not a lot of actual conflict, where someone is benefiting financially from a project. That's an actual conflict of interest. But there's a lot of perception. So it's those perceptions that need to be carefully managed.
There's been a suggestion that your chair, Alistair Carruthers, who's also now recently announced as chair of TVNZ, an organisation that the Commission naturally interacts with quite a lot, is himself conflicted by having those dual roles. Do you believe that accusation has any weight to it, or how do you manage that? If you're a rival broadcaster, or if you've got a film that is attached to another broadcaster, what do they have to fear from that setup?
It's a perception of a conflict, right? So in wearing those two hats, there could be a perception that Alistair might be able to influence funding decisions in favour of TVNZ. What I can tell you is that we have very few touch points with TVNZ, so they're very easy to isolate and manage. The films that come through for funding don't often have a broadcaster attached at that point, so that's not really much of an issue. So when we went back through to look at where would there be potential touch points, we found that there actually weren't that many. It would be quite a different situation if he was the chair of New Zealand On Air. I don't think that would be tenable. But with the Commission, we are able to isolate out those instances where broadcast is a thing in a deal or an application, and manage that accordingly.
I mean, on the New Zealand On Air relationship, there has been a persistent thread born of the fact that all audiences tend to be converging on the same, particularly smaller screens, and the lines between different forms are increasingly blurry at times. And you can see that particularly in the screen production rebate, makes that very evident. Do you, based on your recent experience, see that there is merit for either a closer working relationship, or ultimately, maybe not in the next couple of years, but say by 2030, in a mega screen agency that really wraps a lot of what New Zealand On Air, potentially Te Mangai Pahu, the Film Commission, and so on, do in one agency, rather than having them working at a bit more distance?
The thing with that is that Larry at Te Mangai Pahu, Cam at New Zealand On Air, and I are working closely together. It's one of the first things that I instigated when I came into the role. So we're looking at where our interests overlap, where we can align, where it would be better for the industry if we're all doing similar or the same things, and where we can economise, where we can find efficiencies and costs and share some resource. So we're well down the track with that mahitahi project, we're calling it. So that's a good start. I think on the bigger question of whether there should be a mega agency like there is in Australia, Screen Australia, that's been a long simmering proposition. It kind of peaks and goes away again over time. I think if there's a strong business case for it, if it's the best thing for the industry, then we should consider it.
I mean, and given your background in television, what have you sort of noticed that where do you see the differences in terms of the way the industries or the different aspects, even though they're quite closely linked, of these industries sort of conduct themselves, and how they're both tracking through this environment?
What I noticed immediately stepping into this role was that the way in which film is structured as a business is very different to television. So while the storytelling is, largely similar, the scale and ambition and scope of film is that much greater, and the cost of it. So that necessitates much more complex deal structures, very hefty contracting that takes time, and also a really long development period to get to the film. So those are the sort of key differences that I saw straight away. What they've got in common, though, is that the creatives who are making films have almost all made television over the years. So I know them well, have good relationships with them, have quickly got to understand what are the unique challenges for them of filmmaking. How can we as the Commission make it better? How can we be more efficient, more responsive, and get to better outcomes more quickly? That's what I'm looking to do at the Commission.
And you mentioned this at the start, and it's you're the first Māori chief executive of the Film Commission, and it has been a real feature of your career in terms of the kinds of people you've worked with and championed, I think. What is your sense of how that sort of the diversity of New Zealand is reflected in the kind of really key creative roles of film? When you look back over the last 5-10 years in terms of what the Commission's funded, do you feel like those things match, or is there work to do there? And if so, how would you go about it?
It's a mixed report card. I think if we look further back, we can see that 4 out of 5 of New Zealand's best films of all time are Māori stories. So Hunt for the Wilder People, Boy, Whale Rider, Once Were Warriors. They're the 4, and then there is The World's Fastest Indian is the other one. So, that's a really strong starting point. We're doing something right in terms of Māori stories to have that as a legacy. In the last 5 years, what the Commission has done, and I can't take any credit for this, is establish a rautaki. So that was a Māori-focused strategy specifically designed to address the inequities that we're developing. So prior to that, there hadn't been many Māori films made. There was a bit of a gap for a while. And so since the rautaki, I think there might have been 13 films made. And Mudu, which was last year's top-performing New Zealand film at the box office, came through from that strategy. So it's not perfect. There's still work to do, but I think that's a really clear example of how the Commission is addressing equity.
And sort of thinking about audiences again, just finally, I'm conscious that you basically described a huge amount of work, and I'm kind of pulling you away from it in some sense. But do you talked about these two elements of what makes a successful film, the commercial performance and a sort of a critical response to it. How accountable is and should be the Commission and the sort of filmmakers or the production partners for that performance? Do you have a sort of a benchmark in mind, and are these publicly tested? What's the sort of, how do you know when it's going well and when it's gone wrong, and how do you respond to that?
What we do have is a measure of box office. That's one good way of seeing, how many people went and paid their money to watch that film. We also have a metric of approximately 3% of cinema goers last year went to a New Zealand film. So there's a couple of metrics there, but there's nowhere near enough. I watched jealously at that data being released yesterday by New Zealand On Air, and the depth and the breadth of it, and now the longitudinal history of it. And I can see that data, which is seen to be the new gold, is there's a gap there in terms of New Zealand film, and we need to look really closely at how we're going to gather data so that our decision-making is not only about critical success in box office, but also informed by a lot more information.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much, Annie. I've really appreciated having your time and your insight on The Fold today.
You're welcome. Kia ora, Duncan.
Kia ora, Annie. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.